Here's the reading in the Human Odyssey from pages 27 to 33. The move to Sumer. The population in northern Mesopotamia was growing. As it grew, there was less land for each farming family. After a few years, the soil seemed to be worn out. It would no longer grow good crops, so the farmers cleared more land for new fields by using slash and burn agriculture. To find new land, both farmers and herders began to move out of northern Mesopotamia. They went in every direction. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were the roads leading to the south. Many farmers followed these roads, setting up new villages in river valleys toward the south. What was the new land like? The land between the rivers was a floodplain. Every year in the spring, as snows in the Zagros mountains melted, the rivers flooded. After the floodwaters receded, the land was covered by a layer of rich soil. This soil was free of stones and tough roots and excellent for planting. Since some of the low-lying land was swampy, many kinds of waterfowl and fish lived there. That made for good hunting. And as if to offer dessert and snacks, date palm trees grew wild along the riverbanks. With such abundance, the population in the river valleys kept growing. Once again, growing population meant a growing need for land. Some people pushed even further south, toward the mouth of the two rivers. There, in southern Mesopotamia, the climate was even hotter and drier. Look at the map on page 26 about how much rain fell in southern Mesopotamia in a year. So here's Mesopotamia, here's the south. And if you look, the lighter it is, the less, the darker it is, the more it is. So you can see the lighter, there's less rain. So up in this area, they're going to get more rain, less rain down in here. In ancient times, the land of southern Mesopotamia was known as Sumer. So the southern part is called Sumer. To us, arid Sumer, with its blistering summers and unpredictable rivers, may not seem like a very good place for people to live. Yet Sumer was the land where, for the first time, people really learned to control their physical environment. Let's see how. Okay. Harnessing the river and irrigating the land. The people in Sumer had rich soil and wanted to grow crops, but they needed more water. They learned that if they planted wheat and barley in the fall, winter rains would help, but even those rains were not always sufficient. Could human beings invent a way to water their fields? People watched for clues and found them. Every spring, as you know, the rivers flooded. As the floodwaters receded, they left silt along the river banks. Silt is made of sand and soil carried along by the river waters. Year after year, this silt built up until it formed natural levees or banks of soil. These levees gave observant men and women the clue they needed to solve their water problem. Let's exercise our imaginations and travel back in time. We'll spend an afternoon with three farmers in Mesopotamia as they figure out how to make the river work for them. Taming the river. The rush of water sounded friendly, as it sometimes did in Sumer in late spring. Namtar was sure the river would soon subside. But then Namtar was an optimistic fellow, perhaps because he was the youngest of the three men now sitting on his floor. His older brother, Ker, took a different view. That rush will soon turn to a roar, Ker said. He hung his head. Cheer up, said Shalat, Ker's brother-in-law. Maybe the gods will hold back the flood tide. As if to disagree, the thunderous rush grew louder. The men stopped to listen. They had planted barley and wheat in the fall, and now the crops were ready to be harvested. If this rising river burst its banks, the plants could drown in a flash flood. Thinking to distract Kerr, Namtar passed him a bowl of sweet, chewy dates. Kerr ignored the offer. He paced and listened as water rushed outside and a light rain sprinkled the hard clay roof. Shalat, nervous at the sound of rain, reached for the dates. Kerr spoke sharply. Shalat, you have eaten your share. It was my sister Aya who gathered them. And your sister is my wife, Kerr replied. Then I am sorry my sister married such a greedy man. Stop, both of you, pleaded Namtar. We share the same roof, plow, and field. We are brothers and must try to get along. Ah, Namtar, Kerr said sadly. It is just that I worry about Aya and Abra. Aya was Kerr's wife, and Abra was their 6-year-old son. Last year, after a flood swept away the crops, food was scarce. The little boy grew frail. Somehow the entire family had made it through the winter, but this year's crop was crucial. Without it, Abra and many others might not survive. Why is this land such a cruel master? Kerr cried. In the hot summer we roast in the sun like sheep on the spit. Then comes winter with its thunderous storms. We are careful to plant before the rains begin, but we never know if the crops will be washed away by the spring's flood. Kerr's voice trailed off in despair. Surely the gods will be good to us this year, Namtar reassured him. Surely they will make the river stay within its banks. But to himself, Namtar fretted. The river, it rules all of us year round. Like Namtar and his brothers, every family in the village planted an acre of land in the fall near the river. They needed the river's precious water for their crops. The villagers knew the river would rise each spring. If the river was kind, it stayed within its banks. Banks of soil the river built itself. The water brought the soil downstream and left it at the river's edge. Each year it left behind a little more soil, gradually building earthen banks that helped keep the river in place. As long as the river stayed behind those banks, all would be well. But if the river decided to rush over the banks and across their fields, Namtar could not bear to think about it. For another hour the men listened to the torrent as the rushing waters rose slowly but steadily higher. At noon, Kerr's wife, Aya, entered from the side room and whispered in Kerr's ear. Would the child have a taste for dates? Kerr answered, reaching for the bowl. He has eaten so many that they sicken him, Aya said. She was thinner than grass, and much from a mother's worry as from hunger. But I will try. Just then the shower outside stopped. The sun returned and spread a peach glow across the broad blue sky. Without a word, the three men went outside. As they headed toward their field, other families left their doorways, too, all thinking one thought: would the river stay in its banks? Look, Kerr, Namtar said, pointing ahead. I see puddles of water, but the crops are still there. For now, Kerr replied, but has the river peaked? The men trod a path past the field, their leather sandals sinking into the black muck. Kerr took the lead. Shalat followed next. Twice he sank and stumbled in the mud. Each time Namtar helped him catch his balance. Slow down, Shalat called, but the anxious Kerr moved ahead. Kerr was first to reach the river bank. Namtar arrived next. Panting with effort, Shalat came last and looked over his brother's shoulders. Silently, they stared across the broad river. Agate-colored water raced by. Shalat pointed down to a clump of reeds growing from the bank. Watch it closely, he said. If the water level drops below it, we are safe. But if the water level devours the reeds, Kerr muttered. Shalat dug his toe in the mud. If only the river had built its banks higher, he sighed. Yes, if only the banks were higher, Namtar said thoughtfully. Namtar stood on the bank looking north and south along the river, studying its angry water. He studied the bank at his feet, which rose only a few inches above the rushing water. He looked at the field on the other side of the bank, and then back at his brothers. I have a plan, he said. Shalat, go along the river bank and ask the other families to gather here. Kerr, run back to the house. Fetch the cart and all the shovels we use in the field. Shalat set off, happy to leave the angry river for a while. Kerr looked doubtful, but Namtar often had good ideas. Perhaps it was best to trust his brother now. Soon 20 families were standing in front of Namtar. He read panic in all of their faces. Namtar, one man asked, why do you call us here? The river rules us, Namtar answered, but we can rule the river. Why say such things? A widow called. You will only anger the gods. The villagers muttered in agreement. We work together, said Namtar, or we all starve. Just then Kerr arrived, pushing a two-wheeled cart loaded with shovels. Namtar grabbed a shovel, scooped up some wet earth, and threw it on top of the river bank. He scooped up another shovelful, then another, then another. Each one he threw on the river bank. Do you see? He asked. The crowd was silent. Like many good ideas, it seemed too simple to work. Finally, one farmer said, You are right. We can make the banks along the river stronger and higher. But we don't have much time, Namtar said. We must protect the northern field first. That would be mine, the widow said. Yes, otherwise it will flood the fields to the south. So we'll all get our carts and our shovels and take them to your field. We'll build up the bank there first. If the river rises, at least we will have saved the widow's field. Those crops we can share at harvest time. And after the river goes down, Shalat said, we will have all summer to work on others' banks. With no flooding, our fields should bring a good yield, perhaps enough to set aside for the future. Kerr shook his head, thinking of his child, Ubara, weak and hungry. Namtar seemed to read his brother's troubled mind. He put his hand on Kerr's shoulder. At worst, next winter might be lean, Kerr. Still, we will have enough food, I am sure of it. At best, we can store the extra food, and Abra need not be hungry again. Kerr seemed unconvinced. How can you be so sure of any of this? Namtar glanced at the spot on the bank where he had thrown a bit of earth. It barely seemed any higher, but if they all worked together, there was hope. And what was a man without hope? Our dams will work, Namtar said confidently. The crops will grow. I am sure of it. All right, so that's the end of the story. So in this story, Namtar, Kerr, and Shalat built up the natural levees. They worked with their neighbors to make the levees higher and stronger to protect the fields from severe spring floods. In time, the people of Mesopotamia learned to use the levees in another way. When crops needed additional water in the winter, farmers could poke holes in the levees. The water would come pouring out. People could dig little channels to carry the water to their crops. And this would be like a little channel. As the years passed, hardworking men and women of Sumer made these little channels bigger. Eventually, the channels became canals and ran for miles and miles, bringing water from the levees to the crops. This way of watering the land is called irrigation. Because of irrigation, the Sumerians did not have to depend entirely on rain to water their crops. Human beings were taking more and more control over their physical environment, creating a surplus. The farmers of Sumer had fertile soil. Thanks to the floods, the soil stayed rich. It produced good crops. Thanks to irrigation, the crops grew even in dry weather. The farmers of Sumer had animals to pull their plows. All these things helped the Sumerians reap bigger harvests and do more work than human beings had ever done before. As a result, the farmers grew more wheat and barley than their families needed to eat. When you have more than you need, you have a surplus. Year in and year out, the Sumerians grew surplus crops. This surplus of food was an important part of humanity's great leap forward. Dividing the labor. Think about it. Why does it make such a difference to have a surplus of food? If you don't have enough food, then almost everyone has to work to get enough food, hunting or gathering or growing, just to survive. But in Mesopotamia, when there was a surplus of food, some men and women were free to do other jobs. They no longer had to till the soil or tend herds. Some people repaired the levees. Some dug the canals. Some became pottery makers and jewelers. Some made dried bricks of mud and used them to build houses. Others became priests. Still others took charge of groups of workers and showed them how to work together more efficiently. Human beings were beginning to divide up the work. Everyone did something important, but not everyone had to do the same thing. The division of labor was another important part of humanity's great leap forward. All right, now building cities. The people of Sumer also began to live closer together. They embarked on big projects like farming, irrigation, and building houses. All these big projects were hard work. They required planning and the organization of many people, each doing a special job. These jobs meant that thousands and thousands of people could settle down permanently. The people no longer had to move on to find rich soil. Men and women, their children and their grandchildren could all stay in the same area. And so it became possible for human beings to build cities. Sumerians seem to have been the first people to build cities. You'll be learning a lot more about Sumerian cities with their solid walls, fine temples, and monumental gates. Cities were another important part of humanity's great leap forward. With the building of cities, we can truly say that civilization had begun. So Sumer, cradle of civilization. What do we mean by civilization? The English word civilization comes from the Latin civitas, which means city. In 4000 BC, human beings in many parts of the world still hunted their prey, gathered nuts and berries, grew wheat or rice, tended sheep, and lived in caves, huts, or tents. They painted and drew. They had language and song. They had family groups and their own customs. But did they have civilizations? No. When we talk about civilization, we will be talking about many people living together in one area. Three things must be true about these people. They must have a surplus of food. They must have a division of labor. They must have built cities. Civilization exists only if all three of these things are true about a group of people. What was the first civilization? Historians think it was probably Sumer, in the land between two rivers. People first learned how to control floodwaters and plant more food than they needed to survive. They began to divide their tasks and build cities. For these reasons, historians often call Sumer the world's first cradle of civilization. How do we know about the Sumerians' achievements? For a long time, we didn't. Sumer was a great civilization in its time, but it lay buried and forgotten for centuries. Its rediscovery was one of the great finds of history. We'll learn about that next. And so here is a picture of what the Sumer would have looked like. Okay, that's the end of the reading of pages 27 to 33.